Welcome to the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative webinar series. I'm Todd Hopkins, Science Coordinator for the LCC. For those of you that may be new to the LCCs, we're a partnership among public and private groups working to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the 5-state Great Basin area. We've supported a variety of conservation projects on high-priority topics. This series highlights a few of those projects. We hope that these webinars can provide a platform for discussion about research and its application to the Great Basin. We're going to keep today's presentation relatively short, 30 or 40 minutes at the most, and reserve the second part of the hour for questions and discussions with the researchers and the managers we have in the room. There are a lot of folks on the webinar. We ask that you type in your questions as they arise. We will read out your questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation, and today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the Great Basin LCC website in about a week. On your screen, you'll notice a small collapse control panel in the upper right corner. By clicking on the small arrow button, you can expand the control panel. And in this expanded control panel, you can send in a question. Simply type in your question into the chat area where that red arrow is showing you and press send. And this question will be sent to us to respond to at the end of the webinar. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Tim Brown and Greg McCurdy of the Desert Research Institute, and Kathryn Dyer from the Nevada BLM State Office. So, Tim, are you leading off?
I am. Thank you very much, Todd. Good morning, everyone. First, I want to begin by thanking Dave Stemmerall and the other report authors for their contributions to this report and the presentation this morning. We're not going to go through detail of this report. It is available online through the webinar website here. But what we would like to do is offer a conversation about establishing a climate station for monitoring purpose application. So there are a variety of climate monitoring needs in the Great Basin, habitat, wildfire, rangeland, drought, among others, and also including climate change. As many of you watching this probably know, the Great Basin is a very diverse and topographically complex. And one way we can look at that is through modeled precipitation. This particular map here is the PRISM data set. It's a 30-year normal amount, but this is also at 800-meter resolution, and so it really highlights the complex terrain of the region. So given the range of elevation and the ecological diversity, one would hope that there are sufficient monitoring stations to scientifically support the management applications and decisions needed across the basin. But if we look at a map of the region, including the Great Basin here, which is in the red boundary, you might notice something kind of sticks out. There's some holes in our climate and weather monitoring network. So one of the questions is, and we'll explore this morning, given the various application needs, are there some places that we really do need to increase our monitoring efforts? So as I said, the discussion and example applications are offered in the report and assessment of climate observations for land management applications in the Great Basin. And so what we're going to do now is have a conversation with Kathryn, and we're happy to have Kathryn with us today, and Greg McCurdy from the Western Regional Climate Center. So let's start with Kathryn and identify, I think what we want to think about, you're out there, right? You know the land. So you've probably thought about and identified some needs and even purposes for these stations. So if that's true, what kinds of measurements and longevity of stations and that sort of thing. And I'm going to put up a slide here for you that shows, again, active weather stations, and the orange is the BLM grazing allotment areas.
Right. So thank you, Tim, for having me. We have discussed weather stations quite a bit in the range program in Nevada through the last several years of drought, especially. Like Tim mentioned, it's a very topographically diverse state, and there's a large amount of rain shadow effect and different precipitation amounts seen in very geographically close valleys. And so in terms of grazing allotments, the impacts of a particular year precip can be dramatically different from location to location, from allotment to allotment. And so during the drought, we had already identified, but we confirmed the vast amount of areas that were not represented by weather stations, and so that really limited our ability to draw inferences or to be able to have context for what was occurring out on the ground without actually going there. And so so really the drought, one of the things, the range tech model, which we're not talking about here, but which came up also during the drought, requires soil moisture information in order to be able to, with a multitude of other metrics that are measured, that data is able to then be put into a model which gives a very, a very accurate depiction of what could be expected for forage production given those conditions. And so that was one thing during the drought that we all agreed would have been very constructive, not only for BLM's use to be able to have a better idea going into a season of what might be available for livestock use during that season, but also that would be the type of information that would be vastly informative to a livestock permittee that may be able then to make a a change in their operation as needed earlier than than at the last minute when you actually see what forage has grown. And so that was one example. Another example that has come up just recently is doing some targeted grazing for cheatgrass, and how there might be the ability to have, since that would be phenologically driven by the palatable stage of cheatgrass, there might be the ability to have some very focused data collection done, which would enable the land manager and the permittee to be able to gauge when cheatgrass was going to be, phenologically ready that year, since it varies according to so many weather conditions each year. So, did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So on our next slide here, oops, wrong one. So we have, this was in the report as well. We've zoomed in the northern part of the Great Basin here. This is just an example to give us a sense. So you look at a map, say you have a GIS map, and you can plot, again, say the BLM grazing allotments. You can put nearby stations, and then you can start to do measurements. So the circle that we have there, let's say that's an area that could be a potential interest, but we recognize right away, for example, that it's 85 miles to the nearest soil moisture station. So from your perspective, and you can use this example or you can make up your own, that's fine too, but how would you go about as you're thinking about where stations are needed in this process like this? Is it obvious where you need stations now, or do we need to do some more searching?
Well, it seemed to me that there was sort of a process for approaching that, so that stations could be representative not only spatially but also elevationally. And so some of the allotments that we have encompass not only the low valleys but also some fairly high elevational mountainous type areas. And so there could be I suppose just from the example up here, I couldn't pinpoint exactly where a station would need to be, but there may need even to be soil moisture represented on a if you're using that to heavily inform some management decisions, then you may need more soil moisture information than you would necessarily need, the all-encompassing weather stations.
Yeah, right. Okay, so, and this is a good point, and Greg will probably mention this somewhere along the way, but there are many different types of monitoring stations. The most common that's around temperature and precipitation. But I think for today, in our example, we probably really are referring to a more comprehensive station that'll have humidity, wind, soil moisture, maybe something about snow,
maybe,
as a possibility. So for folks that may not know, the Western Regional Climate Center, we're with the Desert Research Institute here, and we were established in 1986, so we've been in the region for a long time. And Greg, when he came on board, not too long after the origins of the Climate Center, one of his specialties that he brings is instrumentation and monitoring, and he's the kind of guy that can design a station and site it and set it up and install it and set up the data acquisition and the full end-to-end. So Greg, let's say now Kathryn has identified need and purpose and now wants to look at some places.
Yep.
And so she gives you a call. And so what's the first process that you go through?
Well, the first thing that can be noted is from this example that's shown here on the map, anybody that's familiar with this area of Oregon and Idaho would know that not only can the weather in general be very different from these two locations, but the likeliness that soil moisture at these two locations are the same are extremely unlikely. So there could be a need that might be identified that you'd want to take a little look closer at this area. So if we go to the next slide, one of the first things that we typically do is what's called a desk survey. Now in this desk survey, we'll use a lot of tools through GIS. A lot of the tools are very easily accessible, Google Earth, to take a look at the surrounding region. Now you can see from this image that's on the left side that there's quite a diversity in just this small area. You could end up with things that are very distinct environments, from the agriculture that you can see in the area to the dry lands that are surrounding. You can even see in the image that there obviously is some higher terrain and even some lower terrain that is there. So once you start getting into the objective, you need to then take a look at, is there something in even this small area that would actually fit our need, that would address what we're trying to look at. So you can see from the things that are kind of listed around this graph, or around this image, the types of things that are looked at. But we also would want to take a look at other sites that might be in the area. If there is a site, does it even fit what we're looking at? So we'd want to assess the access, exposure, the representativeness of even if there is an existing site within this region. So there's a lot of aspects that you need to take a look at, and that's what an initial desk survey would start to examine. So at that point, I think the next thing to do is once you've kind of figured out within the scope of this desk survey what you want to do, then the next thing to do is start taking a look at the details. Okay, can we establish something at these locations?
Okay, so thanks, Greg. So, Kathryn, how would, so now that you have this need and purpose, now you're starting to think about, where you might need stations. So what is your process for actually, in a regional, I guess, perspective, think about where stations might go?
Well, I think the first thing we would do is, like you guys have done in this report, identify where all the stations are and what data each one of those stations currently collects, so that we could identify where the biggest gaps are in information. And so I think it would be important to look at that, having not homogeneous necessarily, but having representation of the state more completely, as well as, like I said, all of the elevational variances therein. And then in addition to that, there would also be the applicability to do some very site-specific weather station use in terms of getting to the point where we might actually have year-to-year livestock adapted management according to what a station in that exact location might say is happening that year. So,
okay.
do you want to prompt me to give more? Okay.
Well, no, that's fine. So Greg, now we have some detail, right? So now you're ready to go out and really start thinking about this one.
Yep. Well, as you can see, we might identify some sites that we'd want to take a look at next, and then once we've kind of identified those, we'd want to actually go out in the field and actually take an examination of various parameters or different things about the site, and then be able to then compare it against other sites that might be identified, because hopefully the desk survey will have identified several potential locations where we could establish this. Now, here are a few of the elements that the field survey would typically look at, and let me just kind of give a little more detail on these. For example, photos wouldn't just be random photos of the area, but we actually have a methodology that we've put together where you take photos of and from the site in at least each of the cardinal directions. And then if there's a site has any particular kind of a view that is distinct, i.e. not the Great Plains, then you might take a picture from that location as well, because sometimes nearby location, fortunately out here in the west, you can get a higher terrain elevation and take a picture from overview. One of the things we have noted often in the desk survey is that we'll be able to identify features on the ground that once you actually get on the ground at a site, you look at, hey, I thought there was a little puddle of water or a pond over this direction. I don't see it. Well, it's over there. It's just over a little rise that you just can't quite see. So that's sometimes the things that the desk survey will help you be able to examine on the field survey. Other things that we do is to actually put together an obstruction diagram, which I'll show an example of here in just a second. You want to take a look at identifying what the slope angle of the site is. Is it suitable for what desired elements? Particularly if you're looking for soil moisture and you get out there and find that, hey, this is just a big lava bed, soil moisture could be a little difficult. Also, if you're looking at a site that you get out and find out that it sits in a hole, well, that might be a little tough for wind. At the same time, one of the things that's interesting is that some of the parameters that you might be wanting to measure will compete with idealness of a site. Let me give an example of this. If we're actually in that location where we're sitting in a bit of a hole, not very good for wind, could be a very ideal site for precipitation, because the winds then won't create havoc in depositing precipitation at that location. So you want to examine then each of the stuff for the desired elements. Other things you'd want to look at, telemetry options. Hey, what do I have for options for getting this data out of here? Is cell coverage available? Is there line of sight to a location where I can establish a connection? What about access to this site? Oh, hey, is there a gate that I can't get through to get to it? If it's high in the mountains, it might be snowbound for a significant part of the season. So you may want to then consider, okay, if what I'm trying to measure is going to be heavily driven by winter, how much is it going to be that I need to access the site? And then also, as you start to put that together, is if you're trying to put something into a site where the snow is going to get 10 feet deep in the wintertime, you'll probably want to put your stuff above that snow depth. Other things you'd want to look at is the stability of the site. And by that what we mean is it going to be there for a long term, at least for the time that you want to collect the data, or is there a likeliness that some project or something is going to come in and say, you know what, we want that land, boom, there goes your data collection. Other things that are become important are visual or aesthetic issues. If the station is going to be established in a location that people just like the view, are they going to be okay with having a view of a weather station in the middle of it? Or do you need to locate it so that it can still do its job, but is not so visible from those aspects? And then, of course, the last one that you see on the list is vandalism. Now, interestingly enough, vandalism can be approached from a couple of different directions. One is that get it so it can't be seen. It's less likely to be vandalized. But the other approaches can be too is hey, it's in a high traffic area. People are less likely going to bother it because they're likely to get caught vandalizing it. So there's a lot of things that can be dealt with there. For the most part, in most areas where we have located stations, we've generally found that vandalism has been one of the lower concerns, even though it often becomes one of the higher issues as we start to look through this investigation. Let's go to the next little slide here, and I'll show you an example of the obstruction diagram. In this obstruction diagram, and we do this for each of the locations that have been identified in the desk survey, is to actually go through and make an overhead pictorial of what the site looks like. So you would then identify trees, buildings, changes in terrain, identify potential flood channels, because the last thing you want to do is to have something established in a spot where, oh, hey, we occasionally get water running through here that's going to wash out all your instruments. You'd then also look at, well, is there even changes in the surrounding ground where some areas might be irrigated or it's been tilled, or we've even found some spots when we get out in the middle of nowhere that looking at our Google Earth images, it's looked like nice, good, homogeneous ground. Get out on the ground and find, hey, where's all the sage? There's not here. So there may have been a fire that's gone through in previous years. So there's lots of things that you can look at that you could then put into this obstruction diagram. So once you take that information back and it starts to be evaluated for each of the individual sites, then you've got a little more information to then judge on which ones you want to actually target. And so you don't end up putting something out and find out 6 months later, oh, we got to move it. The next little slide here shows an example of the types of photos that we've taken, and of course you can see this is out in central Nevada. I'll let you try and figure out where it's at. Could be many places. But this is the type of thing that we also do in the survey, is to take a look at is what's our horizon look like? Do we have a good flat horizon all around? Is this going to influence? Are we close to a foot of a mountain? Which would then impact how we might set up instruments to measure solar radiation. It might impact how we set up where the soil sensors are going to end up at. So again, another good reason, and in fact there's some of these things is why you can't just do the desk survey and then target a site, because you might get out on the field and find that there's something there that you couldn't find out otherwise. The next slide will actually show you some things we have to consider as we try to locate a site. In this thing, and this kind of a thing also needs to be gone through, because you can see here are two established sites that are very much less than ideal. One is sitting on a roof, the other one is sitting next to a building, which if you look next to that building, there's still a shadow of snow, or snow in the shadow there. And so with that, you're going to get a little bit of influence. So you'd think, well, okay, but there's no snow anywhere else. And so needless to say, as that sun continues to come across, what's it going to probably do? Shadow your instruments. And that which can actually cause quite an impact on the temperature readings. You'll actually see an influence of those. Now I won't say who this bottom picture is, but you could probably guess who it is that operates this gauge. Now at the same time, these things were not just put there at random. Somebody went out and just tossed them out of the truck. So undoubtedly these sites were picked for a particular reason, but as you try to apply that data to your specific needs, you may come through and say, well, it's got the data that we were interested in, but it's not the data we're interested in. So you want to be looking for something else. So all those kind of things need to be considered as well.
Has that fire, the fire hydrant, has that ever filled the rain gauge?
Probably.
Okay, so Kathryn, so let's say now Greg has come back to you with, so you now have some information about these siting issues. I'm guessing there's probably some administrative issues to deal with. So what are your thoughts along those lines?
So in terms of, from the BLM perspective, how to then get weather stations put out on the ground and what things to consider in that. And so these are pretty low-grade NEPA documents, meaning we don't have to go into much analysis. They're not very land disturbing. But there are a variety of considerations, such as what other land uses might currently be occurring. Is it a wilderness area or a wilderness study area? Is it an ACEC in an area of critical environmental concern? Is it some high-value wildlife habitat that there may be a, for example, is it a sage-grouse lecking area, and there may be some concern about predation risk with this, added perch site. And so we would have to consider all of those, variety of needs and uses, and then we would be looking at what the longevity of the site is intended to be. Is this a 3-year monitoring station during, during some special projects that is occurring, or is this a long-term monitoring, in which case we would want to secure that land with a right-of-way or some easement type thing that would enable that to be a ongoing secured land use.
Yeah, okay, good. So, Greg, Kathryn's basically giving you the thumbs up.
Good. It's time to go install some stuff.
So you change your pants and your boots.
Yes.
You go out into the field and talk about that process.
Well, as we go through the deployment process, there can often be things that you meet unexpectedly, or at least ways you're prepared to deal with a little bit, but then it turns out not quite being exactly what you'd like. This slide here actually shows the 3 different installations that we've done in the past. The 2 on the left are actually a site in Colorado where we were trying to establish some soil profiles. And you can kind of see the pile of rocks in the top left photo that as we started to dig out the hole, it became rather large, far larger than we wanted it to be. But by the time we finally found locations to install our sensors, yeah, we had removed a modest amount. Now, of course, given that, well, you can see also in the background of that photo the buckets of dirt. Well, it's not because we wanted to keep the site clean, although we do. At the same time, we wanted to make sure as we backfilled the hole, which of course we did not just then toss the rocks back in, but we wanted to actually make sure that we tried to place things back in the hole as near to how we removed them. And so that's why the soil is in the buckets. Also, you can kind of see in the lower left photo the placement of the sensors. A couple of sensors are right over the top of each other, which we would, at the upper levels, we want to do that so we can maintain a constant profile. You can actually see the soil sensor that's the deepest in the hole there. We actually ended up having to pull a rock out to get that down in there, and then of course then we backfilled it a little bit with rock and soil and tried to re-establish the profile as best we could. These sensors are actually time domain reflectometry sensors that will send back a signal, so they've actually got some 30 centimeter prongs that are poking out into the soil, and so we can actually develop a soil profile and look at the movement of water through the soil. The 2 units on the right side, the one in the upper right, is actually a sensor or set of sensors and stations we put around is part of what's called the NICENet network around the state. You'll actually notice one of the things that makes this site unique is there are 3 precipitation collectors. You might wonder, well, isn't that way overkill? It could be, but in this case it's not. Partly because we've got one sensor there that is specifically meant to collect the liquid precipitation, and when it gives us a good measurement of rainfall. The other one is a precipitation gauge that not only collects the rainfall but also collects snow and actually will tell us the water content of the snow that falls. We've actually seen a recent publication by the University of Nevada, Reno that has actually mentioned how taking this data and doing a comparison is a good way to take a look at water penetration into the soil, what actually gets taken up and is recharging the ground versus what actually sits and or has a potential to be lost through evaporation or sublimation means. The third gauge at this site is actually a bulk collector where we go in twice a year, extract the water, the rainfall that has fallen and been collected by this gauge, and then bring it back for chemical analysis. That's a little beyond the scope of this talk here, but so there's lots of things that can be done. The lower right image shows a tower. In fact, you can kind of see the 2 four-wheelers that are at this location. That was how we had to access and put this whole tower up. Was I think we were able to haul a truck in to within about a quarter mile of this site, and then after that everything had to be done toted by hand and by other means. Quite honestly, they put up a tower that it was a steel roan tower, and I would have used aluminum, but that was what they picked. But here you can see we're actually servicing, and there's a set of instruments up on top that are looking at upward and downwelling radiation balance. And it also has a set of soil moistures in the ground. So maintenance and taking care and deployment is it can be a little bit of a task to do, but after that then we start getting what we feel is good data that comes from the field. Now one of the
so this is fine. So you got your station, but now we have to get the data.
Yes, we do, and that can be the challenge. Of course, most of us are familiar in the past where it was go out and collect it, write it down on a piece of paper, and then stuff it in our desk, which that was how far it went. Or nowadays, you could actually then go out with a computer, connect up to it, and collect its data that direction. Still, that if you just left the site 5 days ago and it's had some kind of a problem, and you don't go back for another year, well, there went that year of data. So you really do want to look at telemetry means for getting the data back, and you've got lots of options there. Could use a phone line. Of course, good luck getting a phone line to any of those sites I just showed you. Use a radio, but then you've got to take a look at, well, do I have a line of sight to a location where I can telemetry it? The internet's great because you can then do high volumes of data transport and do it two-way, but again, a lot of sites don't have an internet connection. Now, a lot of the stuff that if you're with a cell phone, there's actually a CDMA that you can actually hook up to them now and do quite a bit of data telemetry through that's two-way. But for a lot of remote locations, which a lot of Nevada still covers, and believe me, I know, I get out into it, where you have no communications unless it's through a satellite. and that's what this image is depicting here, is the uplink of data telemetry through the GOES satellite, which is then downlinked back in Wallis Island, and the data can then come into a variety of government agencies through HADS as well as in through NIFC, and that's where we get a lot of the data that we then send off and put into our archive.
So the data's flowing, it's got to go someplace.
Yes,
It's got to be managed somehow.
Yes. So what do we do with it next? Well, although we're highlighting it, like I said, yeah, you can end up in your desk drawer, in a folder someplace, sitting on somebody's computer. Preferably, of course, would be for it to be online or in some kind of a database system. As a little example, we've just kind of put up a little depiction here of several of the RAWS stations now have finally been in for 30 years. And I say finally because we're really starting to get to where we're finally collecting data that is of a climate quality nature. Now within that, just to give you a little idea, here's a station that's in western Nevada, Blue Wing Mountain. It's been in for about 30 years. Well, that's 10,950 days of data. This station is actually collecting hourly data, so that is over 262,000 data points. So over 250,000 observations. Data points, because this station will collect about 15 to 20 data elements. Well, multiply that 250,000 by 15, 20. That's a lot of data. Good luck shuffling through that paper. So that's why you want to have it online. And the more you can get it online, the better. Of course, at that point, then gives you an opportunity to then work with the data, which we'll see some examples of that. But yeah, if you want to just not take lightly that you're just going to go out and collect some data and it's going to be useful. You want to make sure that it's in something where you can use it.
So you have all this data, but you still need to know things about the data.
Very true, because if I go through and collect that data that was from the that previous station we saw next to that building, okay, yeah, I've got a great precipitation record. Is it really going to fit what I'm looking for, or the temperature even? Okay, if I'm getting the sun shining off that building into the sensor, okay, that could explain why I'm seeing some high temperatures that really aren't what the plants are responding to. Well, so as we go out, we may want to take a look at, in fact, you can see here's a site that we installed originally in 2010, and the top picture. It's at the Pahranagat Wildlife Refuge, and it's not going to have a whole lot of change there because there's not a lot of development going on, and which is good. But even then, you can see through the years and through the seasons, there are changes that happen. So one of the things we do like to have done as equipment is serviced is that the site is again surveyed and photographed, so we can then kind of tell a little bit. You can kind of see, in fact, a little bit on this picture on the lower right corner. If you look at the vegetation, you'll notice that there's kind of a boundary out a little ways. Well, unfortunately, I missed the set of pictures in between, but there was a year, I think it was 2013, they actually burned the entire refuge except for this circle area around our weather station. So I knew that because I was actually out there and it was like, hey, look at all this burned grass. But they had protected our weather station, actually mowed around it. In fact, that's the other thing that's created this ring. But knowing those kind of things, too, is an important thing to be able to do as you evaluate your data. So knowing what changes in the surface. Another resource we found very helpful is the Google Earth with the images that they put up. You can actually go in and look at images that change there, and there are other projects we're doing at DRI that actually help look at other satellite imagery changes as well. But at the same time, having on-the-ground photos that are in the archive. In fact, if anybody wants to put out a station, our system can actually handle photos of the station every month. But good luck. You probably don't want to do that.
So now, Kathryn, we got the data flowing. Are you going to actually want to look at this data and access the data? And
most definitely. And I think that probably for BLM and in the instance I gave also of the land user, the permittee wanting to be able to access the data for a variety of reasons, this type of thing that you're showing now is much more useful than the raw data ordinarily for, especially if we're looking at you know, a longer range of data compiled. And so we would have a need to look at, you know, 10-year plus data to be able to look at, you know, longer term permit renewal type information. And then also there, as specific projects were initiated and data was collected and being used towards those specific projects, then we would be able to refine the presentation of that data to depict whatever you know, specific metric was needing to be looked at for that, such as the cheatgrass example. You know, we would want a very finite time frame and just the data from that, you know, particular time frame that was representative of our needs.
One of the things I might comment on this too is the data is not only good for taking a look at analysis, but there's actually some things from this data that I can see about this station that tells me how it's operating and what things have happened. You'll notice here that there's this gap in data in this station, and that as the station went back online, the precipitation had a big jump. Well, oh, that means the tech went out and got rained on. No, not really. What happened was they probably went out and repaired the station. It had not been telemetering data, but once it started re-telemetering data, it had all of its precipitation accumulation still there, so it telemetered what had happened. Now, undoubtedly, the data that's missing there is probably still on site and could be collected. I have yet to see if the folks did that, but hopefully they did. If not, hopefully we can still send somebody out to collect that data. So there is an opportunity for making your data record as complete as possible, even from and this is a RAWS station. It's out in central Nevada.
So we'll ultimately want to think about what kinds of graphics, whether or not specific applications would be developed around the data set. And that could be the fun part, right? Yeah. Creating a web page, right, for example, and making it easily accessible to anyone of interest.
Fun for who?
All right, I was thinking of you. Okay. Well, so there's one last thing here, which is it sounds like you mentioned collecting 10 years, maybe more. So there's going to have to be maintenance.
Yes.
Right, of the station and keep all this going. So maybe a couple of closing thoughts here on the maintenance aspect.
Well, it is, and again, these actually next couple of little things that we're going to wrap up with here just show the importance of that you consider in the initial stages of how you're going to maintain and support this station. This station is actually down on the north rim, or on the rim of the in northern Arizona, and you can kind of see that this is the same station from the same view, 20 years apart. You can very first off obviously notice there are some trees missing. Okay, well that could be good, could be bad. Either way, it's going to influence the data from this station. You'll also notice that there's possibly a little change in the road. It's hard to tell from this particular photo, but we do have photos again of this station from each of the directions, so somebody that's trying to evaluate the data could look at these and kind of see what's going on. One of the things you can also kind of see from this, which the first photos were actually taken by the depot folks up in Boise. I took the second set. That this site really doesn't look like it's manned anymore. So this is probably an old fire lookout that is no longer manned, and they're expecting this RAWS station to provide the data that used to be done by manual observation. So something important. Okay, if we go to the next one, you'll actually see again another site. This is in southern Nevada. Oddly enough, I didn't realize till I put this together that these photos are 10 years apart. It wasn't planned, but it did work out that way. And you can kind of see some of the differences that would be attributable to seasonal as well as just over time things that have changed. This site is actually one that is very difficult to get to, pretty much by ATV, unless you want to beat your truck to death. But it is a good site in southern Nevada that has provided some good data. A couple other things you'll notice from this, and just closing comment, not only has the area changed around this station a little bit, but you'll also notice the complement of sensors on the station itself has changed as well. Most of the time that is documented, although we have found cases where, as we go back through that documentation, we wish there was a little bit more there. But still, there's a lot of things that you can derive off of additional metadata. So metadata always becomes an important part to archive as well.
All right, so Kathryn, you ready to start monitoring the world?
I am. Let's get some stations out there.
All right, well, thanks everyone for tuning in. And we hope this offered some insight and some thoughts about the details behind what goes into establishing monitoring sites and networks. We invite you to review the report. I want to thank Todd Hopkins and the BLM for supporting this monitoring assessment project and the opportunity to present today. So if you have any questions now or in the future, let us know. Back to you, Todd.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks to all three of you. Liz, are there any questions that have been submitted?
Yeah, we've got one question that has come in so far, and I'll just remind the audience that now is a great time to enter those questions into the chat box if you have additional ones. So the first question that we've received is, for soil moisture, would you need data on soil composition in addition to climate data?
Absolutely. In fact, with that, we found that the information that the NRCS has started posting online, in fact, we tried to put together some things to actually utilize the range tech model at one point, and a lot of the soil composition types and stuff just isn't available except for what the NRCS has put together on their website. So we actually had some things we were extracting from there to then determine soil profiles, depths, water, the soil holding capacity and stuff like that. So yes, that information is very vital for in locating. And in fact, as you do the desk survey, if soil moisture becomes an important part, you want to make sure to look at those kind of information before going out, because yeah, you want to kind of avoid just rock beds if you can, unless that's what you want to measure moisture of.
So Liz, we have a question here in the room.
Yeah, this is Rick Carney, the coordinator of the Great Basin LCC, and thank you very much for this great presentation. We spoke at length about considerations for individual station siting and the factors involved in interpreting data from individual stations. But yet, as I hear Kathryn's need, it's more of a network of stations that is required, not just in Nevada, but in all of the Great Basin states. Do you have any advice as to how we may design a network of stations in which we can get some representative data that can then be used to infer what are the conditions in between those stations?
Yes, in fact, that's part of the reason why, although we've kind of highlighted a little bit more of the RAWS network that's in what we've presented here, our office is very much involved in collecting data from pretty much anything else we can get our hands on. So as you go through, in fact, this is part of why in the desk surveys you want to look at not only what other sites you might have out, but what other groups might have sites out as well. And now one of the little aspects that kind of comes into that is as you look at it and you say, well, oh, so-and-so has a station over here, you would then want to contact them and ask them, is this a little project you're going to have out there for a long time or a short time? Because we've often found somebody said, oh, well, I've got the station over there, and we say, oh, did you know that was removed 4 years ago? Oh, and so that changes the complexion of it. At the same time, setting up a network is important because, in fact, if you look at pretty much all the stuff where data is assimilated anymore is stuffed into models. And so you're looking at spatial maps. Well, you can't do that off of an individual point, so you need many locations. At the same time, the maps and stuff that are generated off the models really do need some ground truthing. We've found a lot of cases where the soil moisture maps are showing like, it's not too bad out there, and you go out and start looking at the measurements that are actually being done, and they're not too good. Or we've even seen just the opposite case as well, where the soil moisture is saying, hey, it's not too bad, and things they're kind of marginal, but they're okay, but some of the models are saying, no, it's bone dry. Well, so you need to have a little bit of interpretation, and that's what the stations on the ground provide. And then one of the things that a lot of folks look at is they want to really keep low redundancy. Within the realm of collecting data, redundancy is actually a good thing because then that actually adds validation to the appropriateness or properness of other data that's collected. And so you can actually then say, hey, I've got a higher confidence. In fact, the stations where we put multiple rain gauges on, yeah, I use those two gauges so that I can say, do a comparison. If the two are measuring quite close to each other and they've both passed their calibrations, then I have a high confidence that what happened in between was good. If the two are differing between the two, which I have seen, but yet they both passed their calibration, that'll cause me to then start digging back in and say, okay, can I explain what's happened, why the two are different? Of course, in the one gauge, if it fell as snow and the other one isn't made to measure snow, yeah, there better be a difference there. Otherwise, something else is funny is happening. And we've seen significant cases, even in southern Nevada, where snow was a very significant contributor to the winter precipitation amount.
Thank you.
Great. Here on the webinar now, we've got about 6 or 7 questions that have come in, so we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. So the first question for you guys is, what sort of costs for installation and maintenance are typical for a complete weather station versus a soil moisture station?
Well, in general, the installation of one of these basic stations, the equipment itself, depending on the telemetry, will typically run anywhere from $8,000 to about $12,000 to maybe $15,000. Depends on what type of telemetry. I guess a little comment on that is that often the good telemetry is not very expensive, i.e. radios, internet, stuff like that. However, oftentimes those have ongoing costs. One of the things that's nice with the GOES system and the way it's set up right now is you'll pay more upfront for the transmitter, but then there's no ongoing cost at this point. Now there has been talk in the past about changing that, but I've been hearing that for the last 20 years. Nothing's changed at this point, so I think it's got high use. The other thing too is once you start adding soil moisture and soil temperature and other parameters, then it depends on the type of sensor. The soil sensors you saw that we installed, they generally run a couple $100 a piece. Adding them in, you generally add anywhere from another half a day to get in place, depending on how we have to dig the hole and what the soils are like and access to the site. So generally, we generally target about 20,000 for doing the entire installation process.
Great, thanks. And how many stations on average are installed every year?
Boy, that's a tough one because there are years we unfortunately don't see them installed, we see them removed. So yeah, it goes up and down. There was quite an influx of stations in about 94, which then got removed in 97, which needless to say, the ones that got removed weren't necessarily the ones that got installed, but were the ones that had been installed many years before, which yeah, didn't make much sense to us either, but we had no control over it. Again, there was quite an influx of stations that were put in about 7 to 8 years ago, and we're slowly starting to see those either die because of lack of support or just a variety of other things. So it kind of cycles with the economy. But we would hope to see more installed and that things are actually done more with a focus of supportability and what they're used for. So yeah, that's a tough one to answer. It fluctuates.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions here about kind of where can this data be accessed and if there's any kind of comprehensive list of the weather stations, if there's a place that it's available for download for public use. So could you speak a little more on that?
Yes, in fact, our website on the Western Regional Climate Center, we are the host for the WAS archive. We are trying to assimilate as many other data sets, including SNOTEL. Of course, you'd go to the NRCS for that. At the Western Regional Climate Center, we actually have a network of about 80 to 100 stations that we've deployed as well. Those are also available on our website. There are some stations where we will work with groups that they've got a particular focus and they release the data. That's a very small handful, but oftentimes if there's someone that's in association with a need, we'll put them in contact with the folks that are collecting that data, and they can usually work things out. You can find a lot of these resources as well at the National
Centers for Environmental Information.
Yeah, changed their thing here a while. Yeah. But at the same time, I know we've had a lot of folks that have said once they go to that site, they are very confused. We are too. Another good place to find data that is more weather related than it is climate is MesoWest. They actually handle a lot of the data feeds. And in fact, they handle a lot of data that we don't at this point because of quality issues. They're really meant for dealing with weather issues more than climate. But as we find folks that are interested in that, we'll try and collect that data as much as we can, assimilate it into our system, run it through quality control as extensive as possible, and then see if it's useful or not.
And I might quickly add, if you are a fire agency that's part of BLM's lightning contract, it is proprietary data, but we are the National Archive for that, and we can work with you to get lightning data back if you're doing that kind of an analysis.
We is?
DRI, the Climate Center.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, and to piggyback off your statement about quality control, are there minimum weather station technical requirements for the WRCC to accept the data?
Before we accept the data, in general, yes. Of course, I'd probably say our first requirement is that somebody wants it, and they're willing to help us figure out the quality of it. But yes, there are a lot of data that's being collected that, yeah, we have access to the data feeds, but we don't inject it into our system just because we're uncertain of the quality. Particularly as you looked at those sites that I presented that were very unideally sited. At the same time, yeah, I think both of those are NOAA sites. But given that, yeah, we basically try to take, and there's a lot of data. In fact, there's a lot of QC we would really like to do to the RAWS data that we just haven't had the resources to do that at this point. But we are doing a lot of detailed quality assessment as much as we can. If someone has sets of data that they want to send to us, for example, we are working with groups in southern Arizona on the Army test range down there. We're bringing in data from them. We've got other groups in Colorado and New Mexico we're bringing data in from. And then, like I also mentioned earlier, the NICE-Net's another network where if we can get involved in the initial conception of the network, then yeah, I generally try to not encourage anything but good quality instruments that will be robust in their measurements and durability. One of the things we have found is that some of the folks that say, well, this costs less, well, yes, you're right, for the initial installation, but we found they break down so quickly and so easily that before long they're replacing the entire set. We've got a couple of stations that we've put out that are in very extreme environments on the top of Slide Mountain outside of Reno, for example, and on White Mountain, where as long as it doesn't get hit by lightning, it has survived. Our unit on Slide Mountain is over 20 years old, the original logger. And so, yeah, we've tried to adhere to the best of quality for data collection as we can.
So some of the networks will have well-defined requirements, standard. So standard, like the RAWS network.
Yes. Right.
There's a very complete document on what the standardized requirements are.
Yes, and that's actually found online as well, and we've got a link from our the RAWS archive page to that as well. So if someone's interested to figure out what that is, they can go in there and find out what requirements are expected of it.
White Mountain is our highest station?
It is.
And what elevation, sir?
14,186 feet. Yeah.
So that creates some interesting challenges maintaining these very high elevation stations. But
yeah.
They're very important in the West, right? Mm-hmm. Given the complex terrain, the more higher elevation stations can go in. You might have brought up snow earlier, Kathryn, and that these are definitely, we are in need of high elevation observations.
Yes, yes we are.
Are there more questions, Liz?
Yeah, I've got about 4 more questions here, so we'll see how many we can get through. The next one is, what type of soil moisture and temperature models are you using?
At this point, Tim, are you familiar with what Justin's group is using, soil and temperature moisture?
I'm not familiar with the precise instrumentation. No.
I know we've been, and this is about the models if I recall the question, we've been working with Range Tech. We've actually taken the data and we've actually ingested the VIC model data into a couple of our data systems, which is beyond the scope of what we're discussing here. But some of the things we access, a lot of our stuff is not so much to put into spatial models at this point. We let other folks do that because one of the things we are doing is as we bring data in, if it isn't already into the national distribution network, we inject that through MesoWest into the national network. So the data that we bring in, whether it's ours or someone else's, does get through that. In fact, there are 3 groups that we're working with right now that they are using us as the conduit to get into that national data feed as well.
Great, thank you. You mentioned earlier that sometimes stations become inactive, and are these stations becoming inactive because they're not collecting the desired data, or are there other reasons such as lack of funding that might be coming into play?
From what I've seen, it's usually been more of lack of funding or of interest to prompt the folks that have it deployed to continue funding for it. In fact, I've got a station right now that has just collected 10 years of data that the group has pulled their funding from it, and I'm trying to find other funding for it. And then again, too, some folks get under budget crunches, and so that's what ends up. Budget typically is what drives it more often. I've actually seen some stations that were planned to put out on a 3 to 5 year project, and 10 to 15 years later they took them out because somebody finally decided, well, we better remove it. It's not funded anymore. So, and we kind of do the same thing. We try to leave them out as long as we can. Even after funding is kind of dried up, and hopefully find other funding, but the economy does drive it.
Thanks, Greg. Rick Carney has a follow-up to that.
Yeah, sure. Please. Curious, what happens to the equipment when a station is decommissioned or removed?
That is a good question. A lot of times it's just brought back in and either cycled back into other pieces of the network if it's part of a larger network. But at the same time, I know I've seen a lot of it that just gets surplused.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Liz.
All right, this next question is a bit on the long side, so I'll do my best to kind of summarize it for you guys. But the commenters, basically, they're calling out one of their favorite publications, which is by Sundquist and Keeling, that describes the multi-decadal process of funding one of the most important data sets collected by humans, the Mauna Loa carbon dioxide time series. So that publication gave us the Keeling curve that many of us are familiar with for tracking increases in CO2 and potential global warming. So once we have objectives and designs, the long-term challenge is providing support on these big timescales, such as 30-year time periods, that are long enough to really matter in terms of inferring climate-related patterns. So do you guys have any thoughts on how to pull this off, these really long-term data series?
Well, can we go into a perpetual drought? I don't think we want to. But that's often what drives it too, is as need comes up and as funding is put to it, then that drives the funding sources. I know there have been several things on the national level where they've tried to kind of work with that, but then provide up some longevity for funding resources. But so far, fickle nature of funding mechanisms, it just hasn't developed very well. In fact, if anything, more pressure is being put on to be more efficient, if you want to call it that. And so it's just really not seen anything that I've seen work out. I don't know if Tim has comments on it as well. Or
well, just a couple of thoughts here. In the report, we do have Appendix 4 is criteria for long-term monitoring. So I would invite you to take a look at that to get a sense, at least, of what broadly is needed to do that. It's interesting because the network question has come up. You have, for monitoring, very local needs, regional needs, and even global needs. And these networks can vary in size. So given the dearth of carbon dioxide measurements, those stations, and especially with climate change, are pretty guaranteed to stay in business for a while. But you don't need thousands and thousands of those around the world to get a picture of what's going on globally. So the challenge is determining if we're really monitoring a regional issue or we need those very localized measurements for long term. And also to account, are those measurements, the siting, is that going to be an effective location, say, given a climate change scenario as well?
Okay, we have two more questions here. We'll see if we can get through both of these real quick. This one is referring to the permit review process. During that part of your presentation, you mentioned that protected and conservation areas are unlikely to get instrumentation. And kind of the question is, because these are usually places where there's more biology, ecology, science, and modeling happening, wouldn't it be better to figure out a protocol to try and get more of the monitoring happening in these places?
Right, and I'm sorry if it sounded like I was saying that those areas would not be appropriate for instrumentation. They would just be other considerations that would need to be taken into account. So wilderness study area may be a very appropriate or necessary place to have instrumentation, but because of the nature of BLM needing to maintain the wilderness characteristics thereof, we would probably need to approach that in a different manner. So maybe the placement, maybe some camouflage. It would probably be a station that would be very hard to access because it would probably be, a hike in to maintain type of situation. So it's not necessarily that those would be prohibited areas, but that we would have to take into account any special needs that those areas might bring with them.
Yeah, in fact, in some of those areas, often the reason that area has been set aside, if it can be shown a need for doing measurements because of that set aside, sometimes that can help give added reason for establishing something in those locations. But at the same time, it does then often involve a much larger scope of people that are involved in trying to get that authorized.
Great, thanks. And we'll see, this last question here is really short. you guys were talking about high elevation sites earlier, and a commenter was just wondering what happened to the Mount Warren site.
It got blown off the mountain, literally. And then the funding source that we had from California, it had gone away at that point. So that's why it went away.
Wow. Well, I see we're at the end of our hour here. Thank you, all three of you, very much for the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. A recording of the presentation will be available on our website later this week. If you have any questions about the LCC or this research, please feel free to contact myself, Tim, Greg, or Kathryn. The contact information has been up on the screen for a while. And last but not least, we really want to know what you thought about today's webinar. So please take our short 2-minute survey that appears on your screen when you log off. Your feedback is really valuable, and it helps us plan both the style and the content for future webinars. Thank you very much. Have a good day.